Gen Z just communicate differently. They communicate using emojis, DMs, Slack messages. And that's so vastly different than how the older generations communicate. They're trying to be engaged and they're trying to understand, how do you connect the dots? Why do you do things the way that you do them?
Welcome to Evoke Greatness, the podcast for bold leaders and big dreamers who refuse to settle. I'm your host, Sunny. I started in Scrubs over 20 years ago, doing the gritty, unseen work, and climbed my way to CEO. Every rung of that ladder taught me something worth passing on. Lessons in leadership, resilience, and what it really takes to rise. You'll hear raw conversations, unfiltered truths, and the kind of wisdom that ignites something deeper in you. Your courage, your conviction, your calling. This show will help you think bigger, lead better, and show up bolder in every part of your life. This is your place to grow. Let's rise together. In part 2 of this episode, we move beyond understanding Gen Z and into what leaders must actually do differently. You'll hear why culture, clarity, and belonging now matter more than the perks, why tenure is shrinking across every generation, and how leadership must evolve in today's modern workplace. This conversation challenges outdated systems and invites leaders to rethink how they engage, develop, and retain their people. All right, let's hop into part 2. How do you think that psychological safety shows up differently for Gen Z compared to previous generations?
Well, I think Gen Z has the pressure even more of that because everyone sees them as young. They're younger. You don't know what you're talking about. You're just entitled. You're lazy. You're difficult. All the stereotypes. And so, they feel like, okay, they can't just voice their concerns. They can't have a voice because, they're looked upon as just this younger generation that's different and that can't communicate and that, like is just too casual and everything else. And so for many of them, they don't feel comfortable speaking up, and that's when they disengage. And that's when I say, they just leave. And that's why the turnover is so high. And for most companies, Gen Zs may stay 1 to 2 years. And when you start talking about like industries like tech and SaaS, where, you may have a lot of Gen Z, it's a costly turnover. It can cost anywhere from 25,000 to 60,000 for every turnover that happens. So they need to have the opportunity and they need to know that, okay, yes, you're welcome to speak up. You're welcome to voice your concerns. So long as you're doing it in a respectful way, we need to make sure that everybody has a chance to say what they need to say and be considered.
Yeah. And I think it's important to create space to be able to have feedback, but also to kind of surround it with bumper guards around being respectful, right? Because I think sometimes what we see is it's almost like it's my way or the highway. And so then that kind of adds to those labels that come about. But if we as leaders, be it mid-level management, senior or executive level management, if we are creating and breathing life into a culture that allows for space for people to share those things in a respectful way, that then makes the conversation really productive because I'm a firm believer that most of the problems in an organization can be solved by the people in the organization if we're willing to create space to hear those things.
Exactly. Exactly. It's just all about, providing that means for communication. And now communication is not just face to face anymore. Now we live in a digital world, especially in hybrid environments. So we have communication on the screen. So now you think about screen to screen and how you communicate via text, via email, via, Slack messages and what you say. And, Gen Z are very intentional. They pay attention to these things. They pay attention to how leaders show up. If there's a long period of silence between, when they send a message to when they get a response, then they read into that. They read between the lines. And it's like, okay, what does that mean? And so it's really it's really important for leaders to model the mindset that they want multiplied in their environment. Because like I said, at the end of the day, the mindset is what is going to cultivate the culture.
What does an emotionally intelligent leader look like to a Gen Z person, what behaviors signal that they can trust you?
So I think for Gen Z, the issues that Gen Zs face are different in some sense, right? So, for example, they may have a breakup with a boyfriend or a girlfriend, and to them, that's the end of the world because it's their first. And for them, they're like, oh, I need to stay home from work today because I'm just so sad and I can't work and everything else. And to, a leader who is not emotionally intelligent, they would be like, no, well, you got to come to work. I don't care what's going on in your life. You know what I mean? Like the work got to get done. And it's as if they don't care about that person or what they have going on personally. And so I feel like an emotionally intelligent leader would try to understand where that person is and say, okay, I understand that, you're going through a tough time right now. I empathize with you. What can I do? Okay, how about instead of taking the whole day off, how about you take a few hours off and come in this afternoon? Just try to meet them where they are because then it shows that, okay, that person cares about you, that they heard you when you complained or when you voiced what was going on in your life. And so that goes a long way to build trust, and trust goes a long way to help with retention.
If you could redesign the first 30 days of a Gen Z's employee onboarding experience so that it maximized engagement and performance, what would that include?
For me, it's not going to be, well, it's going to be more than just shuffling paper and getting your laptop and setting up your email and, just all the regular things. And then, you get thrown off into a cubicle and okay, there you go. I think it has to be very intentional about integrating them into the culture. They need to be, and I feel like, okay, utilize like a buddy system where you place them side by side with another worker, preferably someone from another generation who's been there for a while, who knows the ropes, and that can really show them around, show them, okay, well, this is what we do, this is why we do it, and help them to understand the environment that they're coming into. And at the same time, give them a chance to ask questions and to really feel like, okay, to see, okay, yeah, I can fit in here or I can't fit in here. All right. And I think that goes a long way to help with the onboarding process. Secondly, would be, again, if it is, they can have like some kind of group where these employees are allowed to come together, even if it's once per week, and just voice their concerns, maybe put ideas down. Okay, how can we make the company better? What ideas do you have? Give them a chance to be creative, to be innovative, because they're the next wave of leaders, right? And so if they come in and they have that opportunity, they'll be like, oh, wow, you know what I mean? Like they can see themselves here because they can see themselves putting their footprint into the company because I'm going to get a chance to actually do something that I suggest. So it keeps them motivated. It keeps them excited because they come in on day one and they're excited. And for a lot of them, by day 10, the excitement is gone. Right. So just things like that, I think goes a long way to kind of help. And onboarding needs to be more than 30 days. For me, onboarding, I think needs to be like 90 days, right? Because there's so much that goes on in a company and you don't fully understand it until you've kind of lived it, until you've gone through a full cycle of, uh, quarterly, they may have their reviews. Different companies operate differently, and so they have different activities going on. And so giving them a chance to really integrate into the company's culture, I think, is helpful.
Yeah, because that onboarding experience sets them up for how long they're going to be there. And
Yes.
if there isn't a connection relatively early on, then they're, to your point, by the time they get to the 10th day, it may be like, this isn't really for me.
Yeah.
This isn't my vibe. And if we're not touching base and being intentional about communicating, to your point, where they want some instant feedback, so we have to ramp up that communication, but also a sense of connection and a sense of community are actually pretty important. And so if we can tackle those things in an elongated way where it's almost like a relationship building process, right? Because you really, as leaders, we have to get people bought into the vision that we have for a company. And if they don't feel like they're bought into it, they're not going to work for you, or they're not going to work hard for you, that's for sure. And then another piece of onboarding that I think about is I laugh nowadays at some of the onboarding training videos that are like 45 minutes long. And you think about when we're used to a phone and scrolling in these short vignette style
Yes.
videos or YouTube shorts that are 1 minute or less, as organizations, we should be shifting the way we onboard people to encompass that shorter time frame or shorter snippets of information at a time versus, as you said, the paper shuffling. And then I think about the painful, like onboarding, old onboarding videos that people just won't, they're gonna check out immediately.
Yeah, they fall asleep. You're sitting there
Right.
for days on end, you're looking at all these videos on safety, on compliance, on ethics, and, all these things. And it's like they just feel overwhelmed, right?
Yeah.
Because it's a whole bunch of new stuff that they're not used to because they're coming into some of them is the very first time in the workplace and they're not used to these concepts. So it's like you're just feeding them things that they don't understand and they're not going to retain it and if they're not going to retain it, then they're not going to practice it. So it's like you're setting yourself up for failure.
You talk about bridging expectations. I think we've talked a bit about like how do we balance that support. On the other side, balancing support with accountability. How do we work to hold Gen Z team members accountable in a way that allows them to rise without enabling underperformance?
So again, this is where I talk about, like helping them to understand that in the workplace you have multiple generations. And yes, they may show up differently. They have a different style of communicating. However, they're in this workplace and they're working with other people who've been here before, who are used to operating differently, and they have to kind of meet them the same way they want others to meet them where they are. They have to be willing to meet them where they are. And not be afraid to ask questions. Okay, why do you do things that way? Because I'm sure there's a reason why things were being done the way that they're being done. And, if they have a way to improve it, don't be afraid to offer that suggestion. And it really comes down to just being able to communicate and I think meet, these other generations where they are in terms of, this style. For instance, if you know someone loves communicating via email, even if you send them a Slack message or a DM, you follow up with an email. So it shows that, okay, you respect their mode of communication. And just trying to bridge that gap, just trying really, in terms of the feedback, make sure you're giving feedback and you're not just, oh, well, this is just the way I know to do it. Be open, be adaptable, be flexible and be willing to learn. And it's a two-way street. They have to know that it's a two-way street.
When you say this is the only way to do it, and it's that my way or the highway type of feedback that I think is very off putting. What are some other potholes that some organizations or different generations of leaders step into when they're providing feedback?
Well, there's the whole idea of, just doing feedback once per year. I think that's just something that, they're never going to wrap their minds around. Right. And then I know for a lot of companies, there's this, and I'm not sure how Gen Z, I'm not sure yet how they like this, where you have to evaluate yourself. I can see some of them liking that, where, they have to evaluate themselves and then their manager then looks at that and says whether or not they agree. There may be some that may be put off by that because then they're like, well, why do I have to tell myself? Why I have to tell you about you? You should be telling me, right? So there's that. I can see there being a little bit of friction there. But I'm sure if they explain the reasoning behind it, it would help them to understand the intention that, yes, you should be able to self reflect and know what you did. And so my book, I speak directly to that. I speak to the fact that, okay, Gen Z needs to write down, when you do something well, write it down, write down your achievements. So when it comes time for, your review, you know what it is. You have no problems. You don't have to try to remember what you did 6 months ago, a week ago, because you have it all written down. And I think that helps to make it smoother. The other thing is, well, we talked about communication at nausea, right? Which is like the biggest thing, I think. Just kind of everything kind of feeds off of that. I don't know why, communication is like, because they just communicate differently. Yeah, I feel like that's where the biggest thing happens.
Yeah, and it's either over communicating, but also, because I think that's a good thing, right? Is when we're not to the point where it's obnoxious, but over communicating more so than maybe we're accustomed to or that we have done in the past. And then I think the other piece is customizing your communication. To your point, is how often are we asking, how do you best communicate? And
Yeah.
how often are we actually then communicating in that way? Or are we just, if someone doesn't really pay much attention to their email, just because that's our primary form of communication. Then there becomes contention because this person is not necessarily paying attention to their email, but they communicated that early on because you asked. And so I think it's really us kind of getting out of almost our own way of a certain sort of habits and way of showing up to be more open, to be more flexible in how we're leading.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I said, they're kind of like the pulse check. They're really exposing, the ways that things were done that could be improved upon. And, if companies aren't willing to, I guess, take that uh, and look upon it, as something good, look upon it as a strength instead of a flaw, that's where they frowned upon it. And that's where you have all these different stereotypes. But Gen Z, they show up and they have so much to offer. And I think if given the right opportunity, they can make such a huge contribution, but for a lot of companies, they're still not there. They're still not there.
Thinking futuristically, as Gen Z becomes a larger percentage of our overall workforce, what shifts do you think need to be made if organizations want to stay competitive in the next, let's say, 3 years?
Well, they have to learn. They have to learn to speak that language. They have to learn to translate and decode Gen Z's communication style. Because I feel like once they do that, they would understand. They'll understand where they're coming from. They'll be able to read between the lines. They'll be able to read the messages, and it would just help to improve the general culture. And I feel like once culture improves, then everything else improves. Trust improves, retention improves, collaboration improves, and it just makes for a whole better environment. The mission then is just improves because you have all these different generations working under the same roof, working towards the same mission. And so, if it is they can't speak the same language, then they're going nowhere. So it's just really about learning to decode that language and being willing to lead and to, not be afraid to meet them where they're at.
If every leader listening today could implement just one change this week that would immediately improve connection and performance with their Gen Z team members, what would that be?
Very interesting question. I would say give them the opportunity to voice, to have a voice, and check in with them as to how they're really doing. Just a simple question. It doesn't have to be a long conversation, but just how are you doing? A simple question like that. How are you doing? Really could go a long way.
Yeah, I love that. Not just how are you doing? How are you doing really? And sometimes we don't get to the really part. And
Yeah,
sometimes people need to be asked, like, hey, how are you doing really? And so I love that. I think that is absolutely something everyone could take and put into practice immediately. Well, as we wrap up, Giselle, there is always a question I love to ask. And that is of all the lived experience you've had, all the wisdom you've acquired over your lifetime, if it were your last day on earth, what is one piece of advice or guidance that you would impart on the world?
I would say live each day like it's your last.
Mm.
Don't be afraid to accept new challenges and to just stretch yourself because, at the end of the day, we're just here temporarily. And so enjoy today.
Love it. Tomorrow is never promised. That we have unfortunately a lot of examples of that in our world today. And so I love that. Lean in and live today like it's your last. Well, Giselle, I have so appreciated having your insight and wisdom in I think smart leaders will lean in and pay attention to the things that you are educating us on because as we talk today, there will be more and more Gen Z in our workforce. And so we should not expect everyone to kind of play in our playground as older leaders. Rather, we should figure out how can we start to get flexible and create an environment where, regardless of the generation, everybody has the opportunity to thrive.
Exactly. So they're already 30%. So, they're only growing. They're only growing.
Right. Well, I will put this in the show notes, but I would love for you to share where can people find out more about you, follow you, pick up on a lot of the things that you're putting out there.
They can visit me. They can check me out on LinkedIn. I share a lot of insight there through posts. And you can also visit my website, www.worldofconsultingllc.com. You can learn a lot more about my work that I do with companies to help them, bridge this communication gap. For my book, you can check out my author site, authorgiselle.com, where you can learn more about my book and the wonderful work I'm doing to help Gen Z.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Giselle. Grateful to be able to have you on and share this with everybody out there who really needs to hear it.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Sonny.
If today's episode challenged you, moved you, or lit a fire in your soul, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with somebody who's ready to rise. Could I ask you to take 30 seconds to leave a review? It's the best way to say thank you and help this show reach more bold leaders like you. Because this isn't just a podcast, it's a movement. We're not here to play small. We're here to lead loud, one bold and unapologetic step at a time. Until next time, stay bold, stay grounded, and make moves that make mediocre uncomfortable.